physical condition this week, I've had a little bit of extra time to get into the passage. And everyone goes, uh-oh. Hey, just want to begin by saying that, look, I know that a number of you have written to me and some new emails arrived this week. I will reply to each of you. I'm so encouraged by the way that people are getting into the text and have questions and things like that. And that's actually really important to me. And I think it's the least I can do is put aside some time to reply in a thoughtful way. So if you haven't got an answer from me yet, it's because I'm thinking, okay? And I will reply to you. But anyway, as we get into Daniel chapter 3, I just want to put it out there to begin with that I think there are two key lessons for our personal application that come out of this chapter. And one of these lessons for our consideration is obvious, and that is the fact that as Christ followers, there are eternal reasons for temporary trials. I say that because these guys were facing a furnace, but some of us here and some of us associated with SAJ at the moment are facing what I call metaphorical furnaces. A furnace can turn up in a whole range of ways. It could be through a broken relationship, an issue at work, problems with the kids, whatever that furnace is for you. I think that there are things that we can pull out of the chapter today that are applicable to all of us. But I think, friends, I'm just putting it out there, is that we need to be able to trust God in every circumstance. And we need to be thankful that our destinies are in God's hands, not human hands. So that's the first thing. Do you trust God in every season and every circumstance of your life? The second lesson, I think, is that when we look at Daniel 3, the second lesson actually, I don't think it is as obvious, but I think it stares us right in the face. And I think it's a lesson about authentic, God-focused friendships. And as I've thought about Daniel chapter 3 this week, I've realised that there is a great strength that can be found in brotherly, sisterly friendship that is God-focused. Friends, it's important to stand with others who share the same convictions. God can be completely trusted even when we can't predict the outcome, because guess what? He already knows the outcome. So, who's your prayer support crew? I believe that it does become easier not to compromise during turbulent times when we are connected with other like-minded people. Now, as we get into chapter 3, we need to understand that it is in effect a response to chapter 2. And you'll remember me saying last week that all of chapter 2, as dramatic as it was, pivoted on a prayer meeting. Daniel and his friends were put in an impossible situation, but they served the God of the impossible. And so God gave Daniel an answer to the king. And as he stood before the king, I still don't believe that the king was... I don't think the king was actually expecting an answer, right? And as I mentioned last time, I think that Nebuchadnezzar was using the dreams he was having to clear out a group of imposters from within his staff team. But Daniel's ability to interpret the dream not only answered the king, but also saved the life of all his advisors. Now, I believe that the astrologers would have been conflicted about it. On one hand, Daniel saved their lives, but on the other hand, good old-fashioned jealousy would have crept in. And to make matters worse, and what I didn't talk about last time, by the way, was that at the end of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar then makes Daniel their boss. We're just going to have a quick look at that. If we go back to Daniel chapter 2, verses 47 to 49. The king said to Daniel, Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. And he was talking about his dream and the interpretation of the dream. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of who? All its wise men. It's almost like this needs a dramatic pause, like, dun dun dun. But what makes this event more remarkable is that Daniel at this time would probably have only been about 18 years old. Right? So I look at it like this. I think there might have been some tension at some of the staff meetings. Effectively, Nebuchadnezzar had just delegated all the stress he was having with his advisors to the one man that he could trust, and that was Daniel. Some commentators believe too, by the way, that it was at this point that Daniel had effectively become prime minister of the Babylonian Empire. Not bad for an 18-year-old, eh? And then, to make matters worse, if you remember, what does Daniel request for his three friends? Verse 49, moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon. So jobs all round for the boys, right? And you can almost feel the jealousy of the advisors when you read the text. But there's something here, something more here actually, that I want to point out before we get to chapter 3. Because of his promotion given to him by Nebuchadnezzar, where was Daniel based? How does the last verse in chapter 2 end? It says this, moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So the lads would have been out and about in the empire, but where was Daniel based? He was based at the royal court, and his business kept him there. He had become the key senior administrator of the entire Babylonian Empire. Now, you go, so what? But friends, when we look at chapter 3 and we read that story, who's missing in the story? Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had become provincial administrators, so it kind of makes sense that they would have been there, right? We see that the events of chapter 3 happen outside the city in a plain, the plain of Dura. So from my perspective, it does make sense that he wasn't there. Because big events happen, but you've still got administration that still needs to take place, right? But I still think it's strange, friends, that we have this pivotal story in the book and the main character's not there. So I think personally that he was looking after the admin that needed to still take place while this was going on. That's where I sit. There is screeds written on this stuff. Some people think that because he was the Prime Minister, he was off in another land probably negotiating a deal or whatever. But I still think it's strange that we have an event in the book of Daniel without the key character. Now, I also think it stays true to the text to say that the astrologers wanted to get even with Daniel and his three friends. Also, commentators are generally agreed on the fact that a lot of time has passed between the events of chapter 2 and the events of chapter 3, and it might have been as much as 10 years. But the events of chapter 3 are clearly an intentional bureaucratic strike by the astrologies against Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So by the time we get to chapter 3, because of the lengthy gap between the two chapters, I think other voices had clearly gotten to Nebuchadnezzar, feeding his ego, setting up what would ultimately become an attempt at revenge. So anyway, let's look at the text. Daniel chapter 3. Title, and thank you, Graham, for your reading this morning. Yet another lengthy scripture reading. But title, The Image of Gold and the Blazing Furnace. Verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. This statue, people, was huge. For those of you that think in feet, it was probably over 90 feet tall. For those of you that think in metres, it was about 28 metres high. So it was big, right? And I think it's safe to assume that this image was very similar to the image that he had in his dream back in chapter 2. And I'll put up this image from last session, if we could have the other slide, that's it, as a reminder of what he saw in his dream. But what's the key difference between this one and the one that he's built? Do you notice that the one that he has built is entirely made of gold? And I think he's on a little bit of an ego trip. So in other words, the one that we looked at last week in his dream talked about succession and how his empire would fall. But actually, there's no hint of that in the one that he has built. Now, back to the British Museum. I know some of you are sick and tired of me saying I went to the British Museum. But hey, I went to the British Museum. And anyway, in the British Museum, there are some cuneiform tablets that record that there was a revolt in Babylon in about 596 BC. And what it says was that Nebuchadnezzar cruelly suppressed it and got people worshipping one. That's kind of what the language says, okay? That's incomplete English now, the way we would translate it. But this revolt seems to have taken place about 10 years into his reign, and this revolt may have set the stage for a public reaffirmation of allegiance. Okay, so that's what we learn about in the British Museum. So it's possible that this event we read about in chapter 3 was Nebuchadnezzar's response to this revolt to pull everyone back into line. Right? Everyone must come and worship this one thing. However, whatever the motivation was behind this event, I believe that the primary influences, if you like, were these disgruntled advisors. Now, I will just make a little bit of a side note. There's an interesting thing that happens in prophecy. If you and I, we sit in this room, we are influenced by what I call Greek thought, right? The simple fact is that we're all here in chairs, you're listening to one person speak. It's a very Greek way of doing things. And so in a Greek mindset, prophecy is the idea is someone makes a prediction and then down the timeline it becomes true. And that's true. There's nothing wrong with that way of thinking. However, in the Jewish mindset when it comes to prophecy is always about reoccurring patterns, right? And it's an interesting thing because in the Jewish world, this kind of thing had already happened in Babylon previously under a guy called Nimrod. He called everyone together to worship. There's a whole thing that's not in the Bible, but it's in history. Then we come to this particular thing. Then we fast forward to the book of Revelation, where we see, again, an image set up where globally people are called forward to pledge their allegiance, if you like. So there's something that's going on in our text today that in the future, I believe our Jewish friends will go, oh yeah, this is familiar, right? Because they see the pattern. And I just put it out there because I think sometimes we miss a lot because of our Greek influence, if you like. But anyway, the primary influences were, I believe, the disgruntled advisors, the astrologers. And I think they knew that if this was put in place, they could take advantage of something about these Jewish young men in the fact that they knew that they would never bow down to an idol or to an image. And the fact that Nebuchadnezzar is on this ego trip is the opportunity they leverage to try and get revenge on Daniel's friends. And we see this start to unfold. So he, in verse 2, that's Nebuchadnezzar, then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, all these people, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. So this is a big deal, and it's very formal. But it goes on. So all of those people and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and people of every language. So notice the plural here. It's the nations and people of every language. So you've got to remember that this is the world empire of the day. People would have travelled a long way to take part in this. This is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of all the musical instruments, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So that's the call. You stand before the image, and when the music plays, you bow down. Then he goes on to explain what happens to those who don't bow down. Verse 6, whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, the world of archaeology knows that ancient Babylon used large furnaces like this for brick making and metal forging. In fact, people, it was the edge of technology at the time. There are also other records in which they used them for execution, and that's what we're dealing with here. But putting how horrific this is aside, it's serious because somehow Nebuchadnezzar's ego had been fanned to the point where not only has he ordered the construction of this idol, but he's ordering people to worship it. Verse 7, therefore as soon as they heard the sound of all that music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that the king had set up. But I believe that this is just the setup. There are so many people doing this that the king who was watching may not have even noticed if one or two hadn't, right? This was a massive event. But here comes the key bit in verse 8. Everyone look at verse 8. At this time, some astrologers, some of your texts will say Chaldeans, came forward and denounced the Jews. This, friends, were people from Daniel's staff team. But Daniel isn't around, right? And they're cashing in on the opportunity to take revenge. So they went to the king and they accused the Jews. And they said to King Nebuchadnezzar in verse 9, may the king live forever. And that's like a standard greeting. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of all of these things must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, the thing that that amazes me when you think about it is they are repeating the command quite thoroughly, and they are reminding Nebuchadnezzar of things that he said exactly, right? Don't you hate it when that kind of thing happens? To put it another way, they probably wrote the memo and they got him to sign it off. Then they come to their main point in verse 12. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. And I think that was the whole point. I think they set this up to attack them specifically. Verse 13, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summons Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these young men were brought before the king. Now that's strange, because he already put it out there that anyone who didn't bow was going straight to the furnace. So I'm quite surprised by Nebuchadnezzar's response. I think Nebuchadnezzar was so angry because he realized that he had been put into a no-win situation. Now, don't get me wrong, I think he's actually clearly upset that they didn't bow. But he didn't know that they hadn't until these weasels pointed it out to him. And how did they do that? They methodically quoted his own words back to him. I also think he's upset because these young guys had probably had favour with him. And as we will see, he's keen to give them a second chance, which I believe goes against his character, because he's normally the off with their heads kind of guy, right? Loves to wreck people's houses and turn them into dunghills or piles of rubble. Now, you might remember me saying that each of these men had Hebrew names that were replaced by Babylonian ones as an attempt to remove their identity. But notice how each of these men knew who they were in God and what it was that God was calling them to do. They were called to be faithful. They didn't compromise in the turbulent time that they were in. Now, I want to put up a slide to explain something quite cool, because we're going back to a museum, people. I think this is an archaeological confirmation of these three guys, and I always find this really interesting. As previously mentioned in our first session about their names, right? So Shadrach is a Babylonian name. It means something like illuminated by the sun god. His real name was Hananiah, which meant beloved of the Lord. So see the switch there. Meshach means who is like unto the moon god. The moon god is now what we would know as the Islamic god. His real name was Mishael, which meant who is like unto God. Abednego meant the servant of Nego, or the servant of the shining fire. His Hebrew name, Azariah, meant something like the Lord is my help. Now, something I think is very cool is that in the Istanbul Museum, there's a record mentioning variants of these three names all together in the same clay record. So in that record, we meet a guy by the name of Hanunu, chief of the royal merchants, and that's a variation of the name Hananiah, the Jewish name of Shadrach. Then there's someone called Mushal Imaduk, which we would write as Meshach, and another person called Adinabu, secretary to the crown prince, which we would write Abednego. I think that's kind of cool, personally. Right? So much time has passed, by the way. Could it have been the same three guys? I don't know. But a lot of scholars go, yes, that was them that we're reading about. But it's cool. For me, this kind of stuff builds my faith, because I can go to these places and I go, yeah, you know. And I think it brings credibility to what we read. But anyway, these three men were brought before Nebuchadnezzar in verse 14. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?" And so the king here has given them a chance, to make a declaration. He's asked them a question, an opportunity to respond. And he says, "Now, when you hear the sound of all of these things, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good." In other words, I think he's going, please don't embarrass me. That's what I think the king is thinking. "But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" And I read that and I go, "Oh, great King Nebuchadnezzar, you are about to find out." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." And isn't that interesting? They were one united voice to the king of the world. There's no record of the three of them having an argument or debating or two of them pulling one along or whatever. Their authentic friendship that was built, I believe, on a lifestyle of prayer kept them united. They were not willing to compromise when excuse the pun, the heat came on, right? They stayed united, one voice, challenged the authority of the world, even though they were standing before a furnace. So friends, when I look at this, you've got to ask the question again. You know, some of us will be standing before furnaces, metaphorical furnaces in life. And I know a number of us are. But friends, if we stay faithful to the one who already knows the outcome, and we remember that the trials in life are only temporary and they have an eternal purpose, if we keep that as our focus, then friends, no one can move that. It might be sickness, it might be pain, it might be job loss, it could be broken relationships, it could be our kids stepping out of line. Whatever it is, our call is to remain faithful in the midst of the trial. But anyway, the text continues. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. One voice. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. And then verse 18. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. The Matt translation is up yours, O king. Well, not really. That's a bit harsh. But you know what I'm saying. We are not compromising. Then look what happens. Verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. That's why I think he kind of liked them. I love the King James Version. It says, the form of his visage was changed. I love that old language. But as I say, I think up until this point he was kind of on their side, and he was giving them that chance to kind of back him up, right? But after this answer, he becomes really upset. And what does he do? He orders the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. How you would measure that, I don't know. And he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. Now this turns out to be a big mistake, because what happens to these guys that are tasked with throwing them into the furnace? It destroys them. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so we just found out that the soldiers who died were Nebuchadnezzar's strongest men. He just lost a group of his best men. But what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly, your majesty. Verse 25, he said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. So friends, who do you think joined them in the fire? I believe it was what theologians call a pre-appearance of Jesus himself. I think it was an Old Testament appearance of Jesus Christ. Now you come to your own decisions, whether it was an angel or Jesus or whatever, but we know that God moved. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. And this is Nebuchadnezzar acknowledging that he has just been upstaged by the real God. And by the way, as a little bit of a spoiler alert for next week, a part of Daniel 4 was written by King Nebuchadnezzar himself. and it's a humiliating testimony of his lesson in pride that concludes with him acknowledging that the God of the Hebrews is the real and only God. Once again, we'll go back to the museum because I've seen the tablet of it. But then Nebuchadnezzar sends a command out to the entire Babylonian Empire to worship the God of heaven alone. And it's a complete reversal of what's happening here in chapter 3. Friends, I actually believe that when we get to heaven, I think we might see Nebuchadnezzar there. And I think he may have been just as surprised to be there as those people around him would be surprised to see him there. But anyway, I get sidetracked. The text continues. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. I'm kind of amused, that he never said, hey, where's the fourth guy? But anyway, sorry. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisers crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. I watched this guy this week, so I'm getting sidetracked again, talking about how this situation was impossible, and these guys must have been thrown in and must have hit a cold spot on the furnace. And I'm going, oh my goodness. So even if they hit a cold spot on the furnace, to come out of the furnace looking good, not even smelling of fire, oh, and by the way, where's your ropes gone that you were bound with? I don't know, I just kind of get amused by that. He had obviously forgotten about the soldiers that died in the process. But this idea, they go into this furnace and they come out. It's almost like the fire has burnt off all of their shackles or whatever. But that's just the power of God. But anyway, in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." Note that Nebuchadnezzar says angel. And that makes sense because the person of Christ in the timeline hadn't turned up in flesh yet. But I'm still convinced it was Christ in the furnace. And as a side note, there is a theological term for that. It's called a theophany. And these things often happen throughout the Old Testament. I should stick to my notes. Joshua 5. Joshua chapter 5 is an example of a theophany, if you want to look at another one. But anyway, that's the lads, trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And that's King Nebuchadnezzar explaining the whole lesson. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego gave their lives so they might not violate God's law, so that they might not worship or serve any god but their own. And they didn't compromise during turbulent times. Then I love it. This is so like Nebuchadnezzar. What does he do? He then makes a decree, right? Another extreme thing that happens. In verse 29 he says, "Therefore I decree," says Nebuchadnezzar, "that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," what happens? "Be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." This guy really loved to ruin people's homes. yeah, he does. But note, there was another outcome from all of this. If you look at that text carefully, what actually happens is the name of God is preserved. God's reputation is restored. God was glorified through these events, which was an amazing outcome within the context of a pagan nation, especially from the king. Verse 30, here we go. "Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon." So once again, promotions all around. And I'm sure that would have added more tension at the ongoing staff meetings, right? But I'm going to ask the team to come forward now. There's a lot that we've covered this morning. Once again, I felt I didn't want to leave any part of it out because it's an amazing encounter. It's an amazing story. but there are some huge lessons in it for us. Oh, by the way, it dawned on me that at this point, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they disappear. We don't hear from them again. This is their legacy. Isn't it amazing that through their obedience, 2,500 years ago, we're gathered in a room this morning talking about their legacy of obedience? But I think there are three ways in which we can respond this morning. Firstly, as I previously mentioned, some of you might be in the midst of a trial right now. You might be standing before some kind of furnace. As I said before, it could be sickness, it could be pain, it could be a job loss, it could be a broken relationship. Whatever it is, our call, friends, is to remain faithful in the midst of the trial. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus used the illustration of the person who built their house on the sand and the house on the rock. And what did the storm do? The storm that they went through revealed their foundation. And I think it's the same for us here. Now, you might be going through something, and what you're going through is actually, on one hand, growing you. If you stick at it, it's forming you, it's shaping you into Christ-likeness. But on the other hand, it's also revealing the foundation upon which you are building. So if you're going through something horrific this morning, then there is time here that we're setting aside now for you to pray about that. Is it easy? No, it's not. And if you feel, by the way, that you may have compromised in the moment, well, the good news is this, is that in order to fix that, it starts with a prayer. The second thing is all about authentic relationships. Who's your prayer crew? Do you have friends that will back you up in the moment when you need them? And so this morning, just give that some thought. There might be someone here in the room that you might like to ask and say, you know what? I'd like to pray with you regularly. It's also, I think, why life groups are important, because meeting with a lot like-minded people every now and again is good for your spiritual formation. And again, anything else that you would like prayer for this morning? I was going to say I'll be standing over there, but I'm not quite sure. I might be sitting over here. But Brett and myself will be here if people would like prayer. Or you might like to come and write a prayer and add it to the wall, and just a reminder that what you write will become a focus of our half night of prayer. So may the Lord richly bless each of you as we enter into this time. But I believe that God's Spirit is here this morning and He's working. So we're not going to hurry this next period of time. But just don't leave here, people, until the business is done.